So today I'm going to try to explain how to perceive a fourth dimensional figure as a third dimensional figure, which is us humans. So let's start out by going over what a dimension is exactly. I'm going to list all the dimensions here. So this, of course, we're viewing this in the second dimension, but it's just you have to perceive it in that way. So this is the first, or this is the 0th dimension, just a dot. Now, a being living in the 0th dimension cannot see anything. So it perceives absolutely nothing. This is the first dimension. It's just a line. Now, a being, say this is little John, right here, right there, living in the first dimension, he can only perceive a dot here and a dot here, which means little John in the first dimension can perceive things in the 0th dimension. Just all he can perceive is a dot. Now, if we add a plane, this is the second dimension. Now say John becomes 2D. That's him right there. Now all he can perceive is the first dimension. All he can perceive is length. All he can perceive is length. He can't perceive height because he's in the second dimension. We can perceive height. So little John in the second dimension can only perceive things in the first dimension, and little John in the first dimension can only perceive things in the 0th dimension. Now, we're beings that live in the third dimension, but that doesn't mean we perceive things in the third dimension. It means we actually perceive things in the second dimension. Now, I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but if you take this object, I don't even know what this is. I think it's a Chinese finger trap. But if you take this object and I move it closer to the camera, you really can't see the depth of it. You can only perceive depth because it's becoming bigger and smaller as it moves away. But that doesn't mean you can truly see depth, right? So maybe the hues of light on it would have an effect on your eyes also. But just like John can't see height like we can, he can only see things in the first dimension. And little John in the third dimension, he's now a human living in the third dimension. He can only perceive things in the second dimension. If little John is looking at this wall of the cube, he can perceive things with height and with length. That's 2D. He can perceive things in a plane. Now, as you're watching this, it's 2D, right? But if you look around you in the room that you're in, or if you're outside or whatever, it's still 2D, because the only reason why we think we can perceive depth is because the size of an object or the hues of light that are hitting it, right? So now this is where it gets interesting. I'm going to draw a tesseract, which is basically a fourth dimensional cube. Hold on. So you would draw it like this. Here's a cube. Now let's draw another cube. And let's connect each corresponding corner of this cube, like so. This is a separate line right here. And you go here, 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 and here. That is a tesseract, fourth dimensional figure. Now, a fourth dimensional figure can't actually perceive things in the fourth dimension, but they perceive things in the third dimension. we as humans cannot perceive things in the third dimension. We live in it. We live in the third dimension, but we can't perceive things in the third dimension. Now, this means that a creature living in the fourth dimension can perceive height, length, and depth, which means that if a fourth dimensional creature entered Earth and it was viewing Earth as the fourth dimension, or it was viewing Earth 3D, then it would be able not just to see through things, but how should I explain this? Not just to see through things, but it can see absolutely everything. Now, let me explain it this way. Let's go back to little John in the second dimension. Here he is. This is little John. And this right here is little John's heart inside his body. Now, this is Mary. She is also living in the second dimension. Now, she obviously can only perceive things in length, like this. She cannot perceive things in height, which would mean this way. But we can, because we see in the second dimension. So we're looking at Mary and little John, but Mary looking at little John, all she sees is John in the first dimension, which means all she sees is a line, right? And that line could be the color of little John, which is right here. Let's say he's red or something. This part of the line in this is Mary's vision. In this part of the line, it could be John, and then over here is nothing, because she perceives in the first dimension. Now, as we're looking down at these two, since we perceive things in the second dimension, we can see inside John and Mary's body. And that's pretty cool, right? Because Mary can't see John. Think about it this way. Let's put a wall between these two. This is a wall right here. Now, John cannot see Mary, and Mary cannot see John, since they live in the second dimension and they perceive things in the first dimension, or a line. But us, we're perceiving them in the dimension that they're in, which is the second dimension. So we're looking down on them, and we can see John, the wall, and Mary. So think about it this way. If a fourth dimensional creature entered Earth, they could not just see through things, they could see everything, like we're doing to John and Mary. So imagine, now obviously I can't explain what that would look like because we can't perceive things past our dimension, but I just want to put it in perspective, because John and Mary, now create them into third dimensional figures or something, like this. John is a cylinder and Mary's a cylinder. And now, how would they be perceived by a fourth dimensional figure? Well, they could see through them, like in this tesseract, because if you really look closely at this tesseract, there are lines that go through the cube, which in our dimension is not possible. So, this means that I'm not going to say these two cubes are connected, but they're almost like infused, if that makes sense. Because each line that is connecting these two cubes passes through each other. So it wouldn't be a solid figure. So that's how fourth dimensional figure would perceive our 3D world. And just remember that the fourth dimensional figure perceives things in 3D with length, height, and depth, which I can't draw obviously because it's this way. And the third dimensional figure perceives things in the second dimension. That's us. We can only perceive things in 2D. And the second dimension figure can only perceive things in the first dimension, like little John can only see Mary and this wall as a line. And then obviously the first dimension can only see a dot, and the dot cannot see anything. So that is how a fourth dimensional figure would perceive us in the third dimension.